What is fantasy literature? Fantasy literature is stories that often have some magic in its content. They often involve journeys and challenges, such as a hike that will lead to a mountain full of gold. On the travel, the solicitor will meet some challenges that they will have to defeat. Writers set up their fantasy worlds on different terms. Some fantasy worlds are constant, while others are hidden and you have to go through a portal to get to it. Another type of fantasy is said to happen in the real world, but have magical elements in it. In Harry Potter, there's a portal which is platform 9 3/4 and other normal human stuff. For example, you can enter the Ministry of Magic through a telephone booth. Fantasy is very popular because it does not have the usual boundaries of the real world, and anything can happen. Some people think that fantasy can give a person a new perspective on the real world. In fantasy, the characters or their surroundings usually have got special or magical powers. It often happens that animals can communicate or even talk. There is also often a battle between the good and evil, which happens in the form of a quest. The plot starts right in the beginning with action that grabs the listener's interest and keeps it.
J.K. Rowling is a British author who is most famous for writing the popular fantasy series Harry Potter. She was born on the 31st of July 1965 in a small town. As a child, she often wrote stories which she read out loud for her little sister. J.K. Rowling graduated from Exeter in 1986 with a Bachelor of Art in French and Classics. After graduation, she moved to London and started working for Amnesty International. After working at Amnesty in London, her and her then boyfriend moved to Manchester. In 1990, on a 4-hour delayed train trip from Manchester to London, J.K. Rowling had the idea for a story about a young boy attending a school of wizardry came to her mind. When she came back to her flat, she immediately started to write. J.K. Rowling became a single mother. She had no money and was as poor as you could be while still having a place to live. The death of her mother had a huge impact on her writing. She channeled her own feeling of loss by writing about Harry's feelings of loss in the first book, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone.
A brief summary of Chapter 1. In Chapter 1, we meet the Dursley family, who seems to be living a normal life, owning anything that could seem abnormal or suspicious. But throughout Mr. Dursley's day, he experiences a lot of weird things happening around him. Owls are flying around everywhere, and people in weird clothes are talking about a boy named Harry Potter. Mr. Dursley recognizes that name, as his nephew has that same name. After he got home, a wizard named Dumbledore meets the witch Minerva and Hagrid to talk about the miracle. The little boy Harry Potter had defeated the Dark Lord, but his parents died in the battle against Lord Voldemort, and now he is left to live with his aunt and uncle. Dumbledore leaves him in front of the door with a letter for his aunt Petunia.
The first chapter of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone is basically just an introduction of the characters and the strange things that happen around them. We quickly get the impression that the Dursleys aren't quite normal, even though they desperately wish to be so. The family consists of 3 people: Petunia Dursley, the mother, Vernon Dursley, the father, and Dudley Dursley, their at the time toddler son. Not only are they a weird-looking family, there's also a lot to be said about their personalities. Mr. Dursley is described as a big and beefy man who is so fat he almost has no neck. He, along with his wife, considers himself above others, especially above the Potters. His wife is the opposite of him appearance-wise. She's a skinny lady with long neck, fitting for when she's spying on her neighbors above the hedges. Their son Dudley isn't quite developed yet as a character in the first chapter, since he's just a toddler then, but we get the impression that he's a bit spoiled from the temper tantrum he throws. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleys as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull grey Tuesday of starry stars, there was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed, because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. "Little tyke," chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4's drive.